All right, so it is great to be here with Mehmet Tohti, and he is a Uyghur Canadian human rights activist, executive director of the Ottawa-based Uyghur Advocacy. And thank you so much for being here. Wanted to talk about really a few things about government, and maybe we could start with the question, the responsibilities of government to respond to international human rights issues.
Yeah, thank you, John, and I'm pleased to share some of my thoughts with your students and also with broader Canadian public. And before coming to your question, I would like to give a little bit background why I'm doing this. Mm-hmm. And I was a university teacher during 1987 to 1989, and I was teaching biology. Mm-hmm. And in 1991, at the end of 1991, I had to escape the country because, as you well remembered, during that time was a transitional period for the world, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and the communism bloc collapsed as well. And so it was a time for Chinese government to make some choices, whether to embrace an open society with greater accountability, mm-hmm. or just go the opposite direction. And so Chinese government saw the collapse of Soviet Union as a lesson. And so they decided to tighten up the whole society and tightened up the very little available the freedom and developed today's authoritarian state. Mm-hmm. It was authoritarian before, that is the nature of Chinese Communist Party. Now, if we look at the situation today, it is totally in different level. And so, because I escaped that sort of persecution, and after I left, I engaged with civil society movement and human rights advocacy in many parts of the world, and since 1998, mostly in Canada. In Canada and in many parts of the world, unfortunately, there has been a misconception about China, and somehow by engagement with China, we can develop a kind of political openness. And when China develops and China embraces the market economy, and the market economy drives the Communist Party to reform itself and to become more like us. And if we look back in the past 3 decades or so, the China developed totally different direction, and the China has used all the advantages that market economy offered, and all the advanced technology that Western governments and the companies invested, and took them as an advantage and turned into their profit. Now, using that technology and investment and the money made from that opportunity, just solidify the grip of the communist power. And not only that, expanding that authoritarian rule and the digital control to other parts of the world. And so we are talking about today that China is the danger for free society. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, my advocacy became more significant in recent years, especially after the genocidal campaign of the Chinese government started since 2016. And in that regard, if we look at China and the Chinese development, we have a share from that development. And because the Chinese Communist Party is taking its power from that economic development to express its people, so we have a responsibility because we are the one that created that monster. Mm-hmm. With our investment, with our transfer of technology, and with our the open market, just allowing Chinese goods and services to come freely to this to the consumer market and housing our dollars back to China. And for that reason, not only economically it is related, at the same time politically or internationally, there is very close correlation between today's Chinese authoritarianism and the responsibility of the Western governments, including the Canadian government. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Canada's China policy, Uh, Till the most recently, because of the Chinese pressure, our governments, it is not the unique for Canada. Most of the major Western governments, they put the human rights, the issue aside. Instead of including the bilateral agenda, and they used just raising the human rights issue in a side event as a lip service to Canadian media. Hey, we raised the human rights of certain issue with China. And it became kind of tool or a kind of lip service to, what can I say, just to show the Canadian public that somehow they are still emphasizing the human rights. In fact, they afraid by raising the human rights issue in fear that China might retaliate or we may not be getting enough shares from the Chinese market. That fear always driving the factor for Canada's China policy. But in fact, we had a trade deficit with China. We didn't get what we wanted. And secondly, we didn't help to improve the human rights situation as well. Now we are talking about Uyghur genocide, and we are talking about the Hong Kong persecution, and we are talking about Tibet, and we are talking about shrinking civil societies in China and civil liberties, and we are also talking about the expansion of the digital control and the authoritarian regime to around the world, and posing direct threat for our values and value system. And for that reason, we have a responsibility. And many people think that Canada is a small market. We don't have too much impact on China. I disagree with that. Canada is a small market, but Canada, United States in North America, and Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, and the whole European the member states, these markets are the biggest market still for China to get their foreign currencies and put it in their treasury. Nearly 80% of the Chinese foreign currency, foreign reserves coming out of our open market. And for that reason, we have much more leverage against China. And we have also international obligation. We became a party state for a number of UN conventions and international treaties, and also many international treaties and UN human rights laws became the part of our domestic legislation. And for that reason, we have a responsibility. Also, we are the player in the global stage. We are a member of many international organizations, just like United Nations and World Trade Organizations and World Health Organization, UN Human Rights Council. And we are representing our values in those international bodies. And so it is our responsibility, and we have a responsibility to talk about this atrocity crimes and human rights violations directly on those available arena, and try to make some changes in Chinese behavior.
Absolutely. And the fact that it is a very serious human rights issue, it's genocide, and it's been defined as genocide. I see that the United States has taken some action. I'm thinking in Canada we have Bill C-262, introduced by an NDP member of Parliament. Do you think that this legislation currently being reviewed by Parliament, do you think it will be effective if it's passed?
There are altogether 4 bills currently tabled and finished first reading, or some bill maybe second reading.
Yeah.
If you look at the 4 bills, one is S-204. It is introduced by Senator Leo Hosakos.
Right.
It is amendment to existing custom and the tariff bill, basically mandating to prohibit all the importation of any goods produced in the Uyghur region without giving any chance for the importers to prove otherwise. For that reason, it is a tough bill, and there is no any support from the government. And another bill, and the problem with this bill is because it put a really high threshold by putting a wholesale ban for all products. And secondly, this bill does not address the corporate accountability because corporation has a responsibility. And now the corporation is directly complicit to the atrocity crimes that Chinese government is currently committing against Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and other Turkic people by using them as a modern slave laborers. And another hand, as you mentioned, there's another bill tabled by the Peter Julian MP, and it is C262. This bill imposes tougher corporate accountability for adverse impacts on human rights occurring in relation to business activities conducted abroad, including the Uyghur region or East Turkestan. And so this bill focused on more corporate accountability, and the previous bill, S204, it is more about imposing import ban from the region. And there are two more bills. One is S211, another one is C243. S211 was tabled by Senator Dushan, and C243, it is, I think it is tabled by the MP Marcus Polowski from Liberal Party. And these two bills just impose a reporting obligation on the government institutions from the private sector companies or corporations. Basically, they do not impose any ban, they do not put any import ban, and they do not require any corporate accountability, and it weaks two bills. And unfortunately, government tends to support these two bills. And for that reason, if we now, as we see now, the United States already not only passed and starts to enforce Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That act basically bans all products produced or manufactured or originated in part or whole from the Uyghur region, with the presumption that those goods or manufactured products made by the use of Uyghur forced labor, and the onus is on the company to prove otherwise. Otherwise, everything is banned.
Right.
And now, because there is a full ban from the in the United States for the Chinese products made by the use of Uyghur forced labor, now there is a potential risk that those products now entering Canada, and from Canada redirecting the United States through a land border. And it is going to be a scandal. And the United States has been tough, and I'm convinced that they have enough research and enough intelligence resources already available before the implementation of this law. And because if we look at the implementation of certain government or congressional recommendations, in the same period of time, U.S. border Service has seized more than 1,400 shipments from the Uyghur region, while Canada's Border Service Agency just seized one and eventually released. And so it is none.
Right.
And so as we now became aware from the Globe and Mail reporting that the Canada Border Service Agency doesn't have any resources, I mean financial resources, intelligence resources, and human resources. And plus, they are taking all the responsibility on their shoulder just to check every shipments one by one to prove that these products made by the use of forced labor. Right. And the United States is better positioned because 90% of the Chinese cotton are produced in East Turkestan by the use of Uyghur forced labor. Similar ratio tomato products are made in the Uyghur region. At the same time, we are talking about the solar panel grade and other home decorating the products, most of them made in East Turkestan by the use of Uyghur forced labor. So instead of putting the onus on the companies, because majority of the products already made by the use of Uyghur forced labor, it is well documented and it is well proven. Right. And so the Canadian Border Service agencies, just for the sake of 10% possibility that those products may not be made by the use of Uyghur forced labor, they are mandated themselves to check all 90%, which is the waste of huge intelligence resources, human resources, and financial resources. We should put the onus on the companies just to prove that they are among those 10% possibilities that their products not made by the use of forced labor. Yeah. And so in Canada, mentality and the logic is working totally different.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is my next question really is about the private sector. You talk, for instance, in your recent article in the Toronto Star, about the fact that you can't rely on the private sector necessarily to police itself. You need to have good, strong guidelines in there and legislation in there. And how responsive do you think the private sector companies are? I mean, I saw there was an Australian study that was done that traced a lot of products to, for instance, Uyghur cotton produced by forced labor that is getting into Canadian products, and so the proof is there. But how responsive do you think the private sector will be to this kind of legislation? Will there be pushback?
As far as I know, the private sector did not take any action so far, and they are at the full speed importing products made by the use of Uyghur forced labor, because CBSA did not interfere them. It is free flow. And the reason is simple, and the private sector is driven by profit. When products are made by the use of slave labor, there is no cost, so it tends to be cheap. That is the reason of slave labor. Yeah. So, and for another hand, the government of Canada, instead of putting a legislative mandate, basically, if you look at the government an advisory announcement released on January 12, 2021, basically government asked the private sector or corporations to exercise due diligence. What does it mean? How do you exercise due diligence? For example, I'm an activist, and if you put me on the top of Walmart, and I really want to exercise due diligence, how can I do that? Chinese government doesn't. Does Chinese government allow me to go these places and check each steps and the procedures of the goods being manufactured? And am I allowed to visit and do that independent investigation? Answer is no. Yeah. So even the private sector wants to exercise due diligence. There is zero possibility.
Right. So it's clear that you need good, strong legislation in place. When I think about, for instance, you've got the 4 bills, and I'm the one that I read the most about with C-262, but how would you characterize the Canadian government's position on the whole issue of Uyghur forced labor? Is this liberal federal government serious about the issue?
I don't think so. It is. I can only categorize it as a pretense. Nothing else. They pretend to be doing something without doing anything. And if you look at the government advisory issued in January 12, 2021, the exercising due diligence, that is a pretense. They are announcing something like big without any teeth, so nothing worked. And the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talked about the clean up the global market from the forced labor products in June 2021 during the UK held G7 summit. And so far, are there any action? No. And if you look at the record of the CBSA, are there any withhold order? No. So there's no any action from private sector, corporations, or government. So Canada is officially becoming a dumping ground for the products made by the use of Uyghur forced labor. That's my conclusion.
Okay. And let's just talk maybe about your organization, Uyghur Advocacy, and the rights Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. how has your organization been able to influence attitudes, behaviors of legislators and the media as well, and what more needs to be done?
Basically, we are research and a documentation project. We do research and we issue a documentation, and we work with facts and evidences, and we have a partner organization of more than 400 around the globe. We are working with the professional organizations in the United States and Europe and our partner organizations all across the world, just working with the parliamentarians and brief them and also bring their attention to the crimes and the atrocities being committed right now with the solid facts. And we are not lobbying with the government officials. We are not lobbying with our parliamentarians. We only, what we only do is just to ask them to implement our existing laws, because the ban the products made by the use of forced labor is part of the USMCA agreement. There is a specific provision, and also we are the signatory party for Geneva Convention, and the slave labor or enslavement is part of the crime against humanity. And it is a serious form of violation of individual rights. And for that reason, Canada is a responsible party. Canada has a responsibility, and we are only working to remind our policymakers and lawmakers, hey, this is our responsibility on the book, and we are not doing anything. So when we do it,
Yes.
and it is our obligation on the book and on the international treaty, it is our legally binding obligation, why we don't act. Our job is just to remind them to uphold our legal obligation and our principled value system.
Right.
That's what we are doing.
Yeah. And that is the cause, and an important one. This is an important, serious issue with long-term consequences, human rights-based, socially and politically as well. And I do want to thank you so much for talking with us today. Greatly appreciated.
You're welcome, and I hope we can make some changes, and we urge our government to take action on the right direction.
That's right. Thank you.
You're welcome.